Welcome to the Stewart Squared podcast, which I have already introed before. If you're listening to this on the audio, although I just realized on the YouTube they don't get that intro.
Ah,
Welcome to the show. We'll be talking about a bunch of different stuff. I guess can we share what we're working on together?
sure.
So we're writing a book together with the help of AI, and actually recently learned that the key distinction, I think, in a copyright case is that when you're working with AI, if you don't change anything, then there's no extra copyright. But only if you actually change the initial stuff, which is how we're going to use the AI to write this actual book, is that we'll get the AI to write the first draft, and then you, as an editor, will go in and edit it, and I will learn how to edit in the process, which actually brings us to uh, the theme of investigation that I want to start with this, which is your first getting fired. I have heard so many times you say that you got fired, but I don't think I've actually ever really gone into what it was like when you got fired. So what happened?
Uh, so yeah, I tell people this is part of my shtick. I tell people that I've been fired a lot and that I'm not a particularly successful employee or student. Um, so I uh, had to change schools in high school, and I just barely made it out of college, which I'm sure you'll appreciate. But that when I went through my graduation, it didn't get a diploma because I was missing one credit, which I stuck around and did during the summer and ended up getting my diploma by mail. Um, and then I started having jobs, and I didn't really know anything at this time. I was like 22, I think, when I graduated, um, and now 23. The uh, and having jobs, I got I had three jobs, and the third job was being first features editor and then executive editor of Inc. magazine. And I started to think I was the shits and doing pretty good. Uh, and I proposed to the publisher. There's a whole nother topic about Bernie Goldhirsch as an entrepreneur who was my boss. Um, And actually, my boss himself was fired. And by that time, I was executive editor. So I was the most senior person on the editorial staff. And I went to the publisher and said, look, I should be the editor in chief. Uh, and he said, well, you're too young. And I said, well, how old were you when you started the company? And he said, that doesn't matter. I did that. That's not you. Um, and which kind of pissed me off. But he owned the company. And what he did was he hired a fellow named Milt Stewart. And Milt Stewart, previous experience had been the administrator of the Small Business Administration, the SBA. So he had run a government entity. And then Barney made him the editor in chief. And I stayed executive editor. He'd never worked on a magazine before, so he really knew nothing about what he was doing. Technically. So I actually ran the magazine while Milt Stewart was editor in chief and my boss, and we were instantly in conflict. Um, in fact, one of the anecdotes, and this is leading up to me being fired, was that he rolled in on his very first day. He assembled the editorial staff. It was about 30 of us, um, and kind of did a Trump. Basically said, "You guys suck. You're producing a terrible magazine." Um, and I'm going to change everything. I'm going to make this right. What did not go over well, put it that way. And certainly didn't go over well with me, since basically he's pinning me to the wall and saying, you. And so for the next year, we were in a running warfare, um, producing a magazine. And the ultimate of that was the last issue I worked on before I got fired. Was the one that had Steve Jobs on the cover, January of whatever it was, 80, January of 81, I think is
Wait,
the issue date.
was that your energy getting Steve Jobs on the cover?
Yeah, we did a series of package of articles, and the first package was about VisiCalc and the Apple II. Um, and then the cover story in the next issue was about Steve Jobs as the founder of Apple. And that was one of my first encounters with Steve Jobs. Before I got fired, he called me up and just reamed me a new hole.
Steve Jobs.
Uh, yeah, because I mentioned his net worth in the article.
Oh no.
And yeah, and he said that, people come after me if you talk about my net worth, and you promised you wouldn't do that. I said, I never promised I wouldn't do
Okay.
that.
So I have some contextual questions here.
Sure.
So this was the Apple II, so it was after the Apple One, after their initial foray where they just started building a random computer with the homebrew. Apple II was when they were a serious
The
company.
Apple II was introduced in 1978. Might have been late 77. Um, and I think the Apple One, they never sold it, or they might have sold it at the Homebrew Club for, like 20 copies of it, but but it was not a product per se. The Apple II was the first product, and it sold very well right away. But all relative, this has been the beginning of an industry, so they were selling thousands of computers, which uh, was astonishing. And it might have been tens of thousands. I can't remember the. And VisiCalc was introduced in 1979 on the Apple II,
Okay.
and that created the phenomenon where businesses and business people started buying the Apple II in order to use VisiCalc. And so I did the story, um, and you can find the cover image of Inc. magazine, neither December of 80 or January of 81, with Steve Jobs on the cover. It's a cool picture, and that was the first time that Steve yelled at me because we'd sent a. So I'm not telling how I got fired, which is a
Yeah,
separate.
I'll go back to it.
Yeah, we'll get back to it. But I'd sent a photographer out to Apple to take a photograph of Steve for the cover, so he knew it was a cover photo. And the and he saw it. He had intimidated the photographer so much that she'd forgotten to put a filter on for fluorescent light. Yeah, this man has changed computing. The one next one over, the one the full page. Yeah, that one. This man has changed business forever. It was a hell of a headline. But
So
she
she
probably
was
forgot.
intimidated. She forgot to put a filter on the camera.
Right. So the fluorescent light made him look evil and, had this kind of greenish cast to it. So he saw that and he said, "This is horrible. I'm going to send you." And he sent me a photograph, that honored kind of the idea with him standing over the computer. He didn't know what the headline was, but and so I looked at the two and it was like a PR photo. It was like, whatever. So I actually used the one, and I told him we were going to use the one that we had. And then I put that headline on, and it just like it caught a moment in time. And it's funny because in Walter Isaacson's biography of Jobs, that cover is mentioned. Walter mentioned that cover because it was the first time that a business magazine wrote about Steve. It's because all in the hobbyist trades and in the trades before. So um, so anyway, and I was fired shortly after. And it wasn't because, I'd put Steve Jobs on the cover or done a package on personal computers. That for me was what introduced me to the personal computer industry and made me think this is interesting. Um, I got fired because of this range war with Milt Stewart. And so basically Milt fired me and Bernie didn't intervene. And then Milt got fired like 6 months later. This has happened twice, actually. It's the same pattern at InfoWorld. Um, and So uh, that was pretty traumatic. It's the
Hmm.
first time I'd been fired. It was the coolest job I'd ever had. Um, I was running a staff of 30 people at the age of 28 and you know, feeling like I was pretty hot stuff. Although that year with Milt Stewart was horrible. The stress of going to war with your editor in chief and trying to keep the magazine running and it was horrible. And so it was traumatic, but it was also like, thank God, because it got me out of that. And I became the editor of the magazine published by the Boston Computer Society, and which I think was just called BCS. I have covers of that one too. And I wasn't paid. The BCS was a not-for-profit user group uh, for basically for the Apple II. And that was how I met Steve, because the young gentleman who ran the Boston Computer Society got Steve to come to Boston to speak uh, at the I don't even know if it was called Macworld, but it was sort of a Mac fandom thing. And so I met Steve in '79 when he came out to talk. And so I spent 9 months without a job.
Wait, so no,
Uh,
because I want to get this straight. So because you said the 81, 80 was when you had Steve Jobs on the cover. Right after that, you got fired. Boston Computer Society, you're saying that I thought you said that you went from Inc. magazine to Boston Computer Society.
yeah, but I was involved with the Boston Computer Society before that.
Got it.
So
So
when I was fired and didn't have a job, I just went to Jonathan, the young gentleman who ran BCS, and said, "Well, make me the editor of the magazine, and I'll turn it into a real magazine." And because I knew how to do that by then, and I did. And uh, we had a lovely time because I was working for free. It's all volunteer society organization, and so I started publishing, and it was only every other month, but so it was basically me and a couple of other people that produced this magazine until I got another job, and um, and and then the job I got was at IDG in Framingham, Massachusetts, outside Boston, and and I started working in the trades. And eventually, IDG moved me to California to become editor of InfoWorld.
got it. So that was in 83. Wait, but you got fired again from InfoWorld.
Yeah, a year later. So
Yeah.
we moved. You were you were born after that, so it was '84 that I got fired from InfoWorld. So I was moved there in '83. Get the dates right. And so your mother and your sisters, Catherine was one at the time, and Natalie was three. Um, we all picked up and moved in September of '83 to California. Um, bought the house in Redwood City, and I was editor in chief of InfoWorld, and I got fired a year later. Well, a year and 2 months in November of '84, and that was not quite as traumatic, but it was the same thing. I was the
Yeah.
editor in chief, but IDG made a guy publisher, and he hired me, um, who had never been in a magazine before. So he was a book publisher, and he'd run books, and um, uh, I won't mention his name because I tried to block it. Um, the But he didn't know how to run a magazine, so I ran the magazine. He did some really dumb things, and so I ended up in a range war with the publisher, and he fired me. And he fired me in November of '84, the week before Comdex, which is the big trade show. So I went to the trade show and I ran around talking to people, going, "Oh, I've been fired. What do you think I should do?" And I talked to a few of the companies. Maybe I'd become like VP of marketing for a computer company or software company, but that just did not work. So I decided to start my newsletter, and the first issue was in January of '85. And you were
Uh,
and you were born in July of
7 months
'85.
later, 6 months, 7 months later. Um, so Range War with the publisher. Now, there's some. Did somebody give you the idea to run a newsletter, or how did that come about?
Ah, okay. When I started the newsletter, I started to understand what I was good at. And what I was good at was pattern recognition. And I started the newsletter because of a pattern. Um, there's a fellow named Ben Rosen who started a conference called the Rosen Electronics Forum. And he started it in, like 79, something like that. I mean, really early. And it was originally a semiconductor
Mm,
newsletter.
mm,
He was really focused on Intel and Motorola and all the people making chips. But those chips tend to be implemented in personal computers, so it covered a lot of stuff in the personal computer. Here's a little side trip, but he was the guy who, when VisiCalc was introduced, predicted that VisiCalc would be the tail that wagged the Apple dog. Wasn't quite right, but you get the idea.
mm,
And it happened. People started buying Apple IIs to run VisiCalc, not because Apple was marketing it right, but because VisiCalc was so important. And so VisiCalc actually increased the sales of Apple II computers once it was introduced. Um, and there's all these details about this, but so Ben Rosen was the one that used the spreadsheet and went, "Holy crap, this is going to make people want to buy Apple IIs." And the IBM PC wasn't introduced until 2 years later, so um, this was all absent IBM. And so I ran around Condex, talked to all these people, and went, "I don't want to have another job and get fired from." Like I'd worked at Inc. and been fired there. I worked at InfoWorld, been fired there. And I went, "This being an editor just sucks." And um, so I was a fan of Ben Rosen's newsletter and conference, and I went to the conferences. So I said, "Well, I'm going to do that." So I
mm,
started a newsletter. I asked a bunch of people if that would be a good idea. And because he'd been a semiconductor newsletter, and yeah, just before I started my newsletter, he retired from the newsletter business and became a venture capitalist. You
mm,
could say it patterned my life after him, but and he'd handed the newsletter over to Esther Dyson, who renamed it Release 1.0, and the REL was Rosen Electronics Letter. It was capitalized, and she named it Release 1.0. Um, and Esther had a tendency to write really long, dense articles. It was really hard to read. So part of what I was doing was reacting to, oh, there's an opportunity here to do what Ben started doing much
mm,
earlier, which is to write short, snappy stuff that really just highlighted things that were important. Um, and and compete with Esther, which I did.
mm. Because she did that earlier. I see on Perplexity in 1983. Um, and it's a PC forum is also part of this. Now, let's go into what it means to be an editor, because that's just in my own personal interest. We're going to write this book, and I didn't really clearly explain this in the beginning, but we're going to take the transcripts from these podcasts and then have AI help us write the first draft. And once you get a first draft, whether it's from a person or whether it will be in the future when you get it from AI, what do you do?
There's different kinds of editing. There's line editing, copy editing. I'm not sure what that is editing.
It was,
Being
I
an
get,
editor,
so wait, so line editing, I think I understand that, which is you go line by line and you edit the actual language. Copy editing is the way that it sounds or the over in or the or is
style,
it here?
style.
style. And then is there like an editor, as in from a very, very bird's eye view of where this fits
Yeah.
in?
Yeah. So, like being editor of a magazine, you have to make sure all the stuff comes together into an issue. Um, so you're actually managing the people doing the writing and the editing and making sure that the magazine represents, a point of view and has a personality and is something people want to read. That's a very high level of editing. And it's different in periodicals and books, or advertising indeed. Um, so uh, the key thing I should say is my first real job, I had a job in Worcester editing a thing I called Small Business Magazine, which was weird. Now, I was really the only full-time employee, and it was fun, and I learned a lot. But my first real job, I was hired to be an associate editor of marine business in Boston. And the guy who hired me is a guy named Paul Kellam, Kellam, who has passed since. Is much older than I was. And he was an experienced editor, and he was my mentor. He taught me how to be an editor. And he taught me very detailed things like if you're going to write an article, you have to start with the premise, you have to develop the premise and then write a conclusion. And he gave me the structure for articles, and which I've used ever since. Um, and uh, and then he also taught me about editing for a magazine and how it fits into the magazine and how everything has to make sense to the reader. That was all done at Marine Business, editing a magazine for boat dealers. And I have a lot of stories about that because it was a really important period in my life. I learned a lot about business and I learned all about editing. And then he was moved to become editor of Inc., which was published by the same company. And so I became the editor in chief of Marine Business. And uh, it's important to remember the times here, but there were two oil crises within about 18 months of each other. And in the second oil crisis, the boat business went to hell in a handbasket, right? Owning a boat and pouring gas into it to run around on the water became an uneconomic recreational activity. So all boat companies went out of business and the industry and our advertising disappeared. So Bernie, publisher of both, sold the magazine to the competition and without the staff. So I laid off the whole staff. And then Paul hired me to be a features editor at Inc. magazine. Um, so
Very good stuff.
um,
Very interesting. I mean, the first is just wild is just how the oil crisis changed boating in America. I imagine before that it was just like the heaven, right? Heaven as the American dream, where you could just get on a boat and middle class guy could buy a boat, go everywhere, go out in the ocean.
fiberglass boats. I mean, fiberglass was introduced in the 50s, maybe the 60s on boats. And it was incredibly cheap, much cheaper than wooden boats that were made by hand. And they're mass produced, and there are several big companies, two big engine companies. Uh, see, see if I can remember who they were. Anyway, two big engine companies. I went and toured engine factories in the Midwest. That was like cool. And then like companies like Bayliner, which I think still exists, and several other big motorboat companies. There are also sailboats. That's a different phenomenon because sailboats don't require fuel except to get you out so you can raise the sails.
Uh, okay, so the oil crisis, another theme in this show is how we talk about politics. It also reminds me of the tariffs, but I will resist that red herring to go.
Yeah, right now, because
Yeah, yeah,
let's wait and see what happens since he
yeah.
only just put him on last night.
Yeah.
Um,
Could we
so
talk
anyway,
about
getting I
go
think
for
we were talking about getting fired. So
editing, editing.
editing. That's right. We were talking about editing. So editing in terms of the book we're talking about is different than editing articles in a periodical, whether it's a newspaper or a magazine, or whatever it is now, uh, websites, news services. The So I've never edited a book. I've never written a book, and So I'm going to struggle in being able to articulate this. But what I'm looking for is for the AI to organize all the stuff we've talked about here into, a timeline. And, the objective is for me to write a biography um, that, I guess, an autobiography, because auto means you're doing it yourself, um, that uh, that uses my life as a timeline. But as we've been talking about on this podcast, that's also the timeline for the personal computer industry and everything that's happened since. Before the PC, it was like mainframes and mini computers, and I kind of knew about that. But I actually wrote a column in Inc. magazine that said, we've been writing about mini computers and how important it is for small business to know about mini computers, and you guys never read those articles. You're obviously bored by the topic of computers. You're into running businesses and knowing how to do that. So we're not going to write those articles anymore. I don't know if I could go back and find that. Um, but that was right before I learned about the personal computer. So that was kind of the context for me to go like, holy crap, look, I can use this computer. And just to give you the anecdote, I was introduced to the people, right? People in Boston, Steve Jobs and stuff. And I said to myself, I got to get one of these. So I went and bought an Apple II Plus, um, and at a local store, and got a copy of VisiCalc because that was the thing I had to learn about, and set them up on the dining room table. And it was like I had no idea what it was doing. I didn't know anything about computers, like zero about computers. So I did what I usually do is go talk to people, and that's the key question I'd ask is, okay, got this personal computer. What's the difference between hardware and software? Literally. And it's like, I'd ask like 12 people. I get 12 different answers. I couldn't normalize. I couldn't find where, I had to, I said, as part of it, I had to go do it myself so I could figure this out. So I set up the Apple II that had a green screen monitor on it that plugged into the back. And the Apple II, you could open that up and put cards in it and stuff like that. You could modify it, which Steve Jobs said that never again, um, after he went to the Mac. And so uh, I got it set up. It took me like a couple hours. I was like messing. I couldn't, I didn't know anything. And I plugged it in and turned it on, and there's like a little blinking cursor. So you had to put a floppy disk in and load a program for the program to come up. And so I did that with the VisiCalc disk, and it came up and it had a spreadsheet on the screen. It's 40 by 20, because it was a green screen. It wasn't even graphical. And so then I read the manual and I started playing with it, and I got it right away because I knew what spreadsheets were on paper. And like everybody did, that was the experience. Everybody go like, oh yeah, I get this. Oh, and look, I can type these numbers in and then I can change the result with a tap of a button. And it was like, and you mentioned Gasset, Jean-Louis Gasset was the one that said the thing about VisiCalc that really just charmed everybody and made it so popular. It was like a game. It was like playing a game with numbers, and you could recalc. You could change an assumption and recalc, and you could just like think all these things through. And it was a little bit like an adventure game, which was also happening on the Apple II. Um, I may
Okay.
have may have jumped over the edge there, but
Well, no, no. This is the first time I understand why the spreadsheet was the important one. That was the first crystallization of what it did for people.
yeah, just to say there were word processors before that on the Apple II and
Absolutely.
on the Commodore, the Radio Shack.
And the theme I'm getting, which is really interesting, was that the business people didn't care about mini computers until it affected spreadsheets, publishing, games, and other things. And but this idea of business people not caring about technology until it affects the business is a theme that kept on playing out over and over again, right? Recently, there are two
It's
interviews that
exactly my point of view about AI, to bring it all the way out.
yeah.
AI is like this concept, and people sit around the boardroom and go, we have to have some of that AI. What are we doing about that? But they don't actually understand what it is or what it means. Excuse me. Um, that tweet you sent me from Signal,
Yeah, the rando anon on Twitter.
yeah, that's that's it right there.
Yeah,
That's what I'm looking for. I'm glad you found it and sent it to me because this guy's saying, look, Apple knows what it's doing, and it is going to have a device-based
yeah.
LLM or LM uh, that uses your personal information to deliver value to you. I go, well, wow, wow. That's exactly it. That's what. But I've been losing faith that Apple actually is working on it.
That's the
Um,
funny thing. If we go back about 10 episodes, you were telling me, and I believed it, that Apple was going to win this because they were smart about it. And so then I went and I bought the iPhone. Their first iteration did not work. It was not. So I lost faith in Apple until DeepSeek happened with the small, the total, which I had predicted. I predicted this 2 years ago that open source would win. And so that the software, you can't build a moat around this software and that it's just going to spread and multiply. And that's all happening. But Apple is right on their strategy, which is we'll do something. We did the announcement, but the announcement doesn't really matter because, as you said, all the business people are it's just so confusing with the hype because the hype has never been this way. Like, even we could go back into the show because that's actually another thing we need to investigate is what happened in 1999 and whether in 1999, 2000, 2001, and is it anything? It feels like the AI thing is like that on hyperdrive, but
that's why DeepSeek raised the question as an existential threat to the AI industry as it is currently formed because they did it so cheap. Like, if you don't need to spend billions of dollars on NVIDIA chips and processing these large language models, if you don't need to do that, then what the hell's going to happen to all those companies that just raised billions of dollars? It's
yeah,
like, uh, and you can see the thread that's going through it is, well, maybe OpenAI can survive, but the rest of them are sunk. And that's why NVIDIA lost 600 billion. Of course, they got it back since, but
and there's another theory. There's another thing that's headed into this, which is that uh, the psyops of the information age are here, and the CCP can't be trusted. And any company in China has a backdoor to the CCP, and the Chinese are known for lying a lot, and most of the data can't be trusted. So the $5 million figure is probably bullshit. They probably spent a huge amount of money training this thing, and then just lied about how much money they spent.
so yeah, there's a number of thoughts about that. Part of it is that they got their H100 chips
Yeah,
before Biden
yeah,
outlawed them, so they've been using them for a while.
yeah.
And that maybe the cost wasn't 5 million per se, but they distilled
They did something.
OpenAI's
Yeah, I don't mean to say
and
they did something powerful and they did something at
yeah,
much cheaper, but not to the
yeah,
extent.
even if it scales up 100x, it's
Yeah,
still much cheaper than everything else. Um, so, uh, but I mean, I think you and I think have been thinking the same thing. We're triggered by the same interview you did with the CEO of Numenta, um, where the baseline is our brain, and our brain takes what 2.5 watts to operate, sits in our head, and operate and processes everything in real time with no large language model. Everything is, and so it can reason and intuit and do all these things that AI still can't. Um, there's a subtext in all of the stuff that OpenAI and other people are doing about reasoning, and I haven't quite figured out if they're referring to what we do or if they're just saying it's better than what AI has been doing.
yeah.
Um, so I haven't kind of worked that out in my head. But
You got an
so,
interview listen to that goes into that.
and this is why you keep wanting to interview me about this stuff because I've seen this before. And yeah, 99
Let's go.
went overboard.
What happened in 99? Well, it's 97 to 99, right?
No, it's 94 to 99. I switched careers and became a venture capitalist in 96. It had already started happening by then. So 94, approximately 94, the key thing that had to happen was originally the internet was only available to educational institutions. There was no .com. Well, there was a .com, if you understand the structure of that, it can be .anything, which it is now. Um, and but at the time there were sort of set domains, .gov, .edu, .mil, and .com was not really used. And then there was a rule change, and I can't figure out exactly who did that, but whatever the governing body on the internet is, ICON, or now called ICON, I think, but said, okay, let's make this commercial. And people started adopting it. And that was the experience I had in 94 was I got, I was editor of InfoWorld the second time around, and I got the IT department to give me a floppy disk with Mosaic on it, popped it into my Windows computer, installed the browser from the command line, and got the browser and started browsing. It was like, holy cow, I was late, right? This is late 94. And uh, this is like just the beginning. This is like hundreds of websites out there, not millions or billions. This is the very beginning. And I just started clicking around, looking at stuff and going, oh my God, look at this. This is like amazing. And there was no Google search, but you had like 5 different ways to organize it. Yahoo was up. And
Yeah.
and so you could see the possibilities, right? And this is what's equivalent when you got the first iPhone, when you got the first Chat GPT, when it got VisiCalc, seeing the possibilities is what the trigger is that blows people's minds. And it starts small and then expands. And so I was late loading the Mosaic browser into my computer, even though I was the editor in chief of a computer magazine. And so we'd been reporting on it, but I had not actually done it myself. And that experience of doing it myself was mind blowing. I literally actually didn't do my job for the next weeks, possibly months, just like sitting there going, what is that? And then I sat and thought about it and said, well, we have to do this. We, InfoWorld, have to put our stuff on the internet. And I came up and I named it and I called it InfoWorld Electric. Because I was sitting there going, well, there's InfoWorld. We print it and distribute it weekly. And then there's this on the web. And what are you going to call it? And so I called it InfoWorld Electric. We didn't really even use the word digital at the time, but that's probably what I should have called it. But, ultimately it just became InfoWorld.com. And we had the logo and, you put it up on the web. It took us a while to figure that out. And I applied all my understanding about magazines to the website. Like in a magazine, you have a border and you could do photos that went past the border and then they get trimmed when the magazine was printed. And it's called a bleed. It would bleed to the edge. And so I started thinking, well, if you can you do a bleed on a web page? Like there's no printing press to cut the magazine. It's like I was mightily struggling trying to figure out how to use what I knew to apply to the World Wide Web.
So, okay, well, there's a lot there that I like the last point you made, which is really
Oh, I
interesting.
never got to 99. I never
Yeah.
got to 99. So that started in 94. So over the next 6 years, 5 years, phew, money just flooded in, right? There was venture capital. We raised like, I can't remember what it was in 99, but like $1 billion in venture capital. When I started at NEA, their big fund, the fund that I joined in 96 was 360 million, which was considered gigantic.
Mm.
But they raised $1 billion fund in 99. So huge amount of money going in. And so everything that moved got funded. And it was across the board. It was like software companies, like browsers and what you could do on the other side of the browser and the pipes. I mean, they went nuts on optical fiber, putting optical fiber into the ground all across the country. They dug trenches and put fiber in to be able to enable the high-speed internet. And a lot of that just went away, except the fiber was still in the ground. It's used today. But the people who put it in the ground went out of business, and somebody else bought it out of bankruptcy and made money on it.
There's a lot of things that I want to get to the point of whether the businesses experience, the traditional businesses that weren't on the internet experience the same level of hype that they're experiencing now for getting on AI. But before we go into that, there's something really interesting that I discovered. So about the .com, which is that icon, originally Perplexity said it's icon, but then it gave me a timeline that said that ICANN is formed in 1995. No, 1998. So it had to have happened before then. And I found out that it was
Yeah,
actually
ICANN is took over from whatever was there
yeah, so
before.
pre-ICANN administration, the .com domain was administered by various entities, initially by the U.S. Department of Defense, which is really interesting.
Yeah.
And then from 91 to 93,
DARPA invented the internet, right?
DARPA,
DARPA is part of the Department of Defense.
and the DARPA had its relationship with the universities. And then from 91 to 93, it was Government Systems Inc., which subcontracted to Network
Yes,
Solutions. And
yeah,
then
and the network solutions, yeah.
And then 93, National Science Foundation took responsibility. That's interesting. The National Science. Okay. But
NSF, yeah.
yeah. So they created this .com. I didn't realize that .com was for commercial, although that's now very obvious. So yeah, let's go into this question of for the last 10 minutes or so of this. Did Because you were writing for businesses who were not on the internet about the internet. And when did the hype train when specifically did the hype diverge from the reality of the internet?
Webvan. Um, so, I mean, it's iconic, or
Yeah,
pets.com, or a bunch of companies that were funded by venture capitalists that
97.
just failed, never got anywhere. But pets.com actually did get somewhere. They did do some uh, business, but they never made money, went out of business. But uh, so um, the phenomenon of sitting in a boardroom and going, we got to get some of that internet, didn't happen until after the crash.
Okay.
Um, so it was not that banks sat there and thought they should be doing something about this, or that there were early, they put stuff on the web, but it was really crappy.
Yeah.
Um, and uh, it was not considered compelling. But this is also true if you read the history of the New York Times. The old editors were sitting around going, yeah, this internet thing. And they put the internet editing business in a different building. It was like 6 blocks away from the New York Times building. Um, and so you could see it in all of the domains. Now, this will go on a little longer than you want, but um, the anecdote that I tell about Elon Musk and when I met him was he started a company called X.com in 1996, I think. And he'd bought that URL. There's only 6 single letter URLs, X.com, for $5 million from an outcome that he'd had selling his prior company. And and so he wanted to build a bank, an online bank, in 1996. And he hired a team from the Royal Bank of Canada who had been running the IT operations for the Royal Bank of Canada, and moved him to Palo Alto. And I went in to present terms to him. And I had a term sheet. It was printed and in my pocket. It's actually wearing a sport coat. And I went to visit him to present terms. And the office was empty. All the lights, I think I told this before, but and he was there by himself in a conference room. The conference room had lights on it. So he came in and I said, so where is everybody? He says, oh, I fired them all. And I'm sitting there in my simple mind, which, I regret forever, at some level, and said, wow, that's kind of a material change of circumstance, which every term sheet in the world, well, you don't even get to it with term sheets because they aren't binding. But I said, I'm going to have to go review this with my partners. And I left the office and I was like, "Phew, boy, dodged a bullet there."
Was
Of
was that
course,
a deal?
Mike Moritz did the deal, which is why
Was
he's
that a
way
deal that
better.
somebody else at NEA had started and you followed up on, or was that a deal that you sourced yourself?
No, I sourced myself. A,
Oh, yeah.
a lawyer friend of mine said, you might be interested in talking to this fellow Elon Musk because he's proposing this, and
Who's
I,
that lawyer friend?
I was writing columns for Fortune at the time. So um, people knew what I was interested in because I wrote columns. They read it.
Who was the lawyer friend?
I don't remember which lawyer.
Yeah. Okay. So it was really web van. We got X.com trying to build a bank. The bank,
Which merged with PayPal because PayPal was trying to do, online credit and became a much bigger thing that was sold to eBay. And Mike made a lot of money where I could have. Um, but what started to happen was businesses that didn't make sense. I mean, being an online bank actually, in retrospect, was visionary. Um, and I give credit to myself. I was looking for one. I wanted to find somebody who was building a bank online because you
um,
don't need branches. Money is just information anyway, um, all of which has been true. And I was able to, work that
mm,
out. But Alon actually did it. And so it was too early, but it was still a legitimate idea. And at some level, I bought Webvan stock because I thought it was a legitimate idea. And Amazon has demonstrated that it is. It was and became enormous, but it was way too early for Webvan to do it. And they screwed it up by hiring the wrong people and so on and so forth. So a lot of the ideas that were rampant at the time presumed that you had a high-speed internet, and we didn't even know about the mobile phone yet. Um, So, when it went overboard is when venture capitalists started to compete to invest in businesses that really like instant delivery in New York City. And I mean,
yeah,
there were all these, it was like so exciting and all these ideas, and the venture capitalists got caught up in it, and the entrepreneurs got caught up in it. And what's survived since then? What, Yahoo is still something. I think it's owned by like Verizon. Um, I haven't even gone to yahoo.com in years. Don't know who does that, but AOL. I mean, I think Verizon also owns AOL, but so all the stuff that was done, the protocols survived, HTTP and the security protocols and stuff have survived because that stuff needs to keep going. But the businesses on top of it, I mean, are we still? What I'm trying to think, Google was started in '99. It was founded in '99.
yeah.
And so there's not much left from those early years.
And this is the clear parallel with AI is that particularly probably it's stopping now. It's probably going to stop now, but maybe keep on continuing is just the amount of money going into AI. If you have an AI company, you can raise money really easily. But it's all just
Not so it's getting harder. It is
yeah.
getting harder because people are beginning to compare the fundamentals. Like the observation on Claude at this point is, or Anthropic, is that their revenue is about 10 or 15% as much as OpenAI's.
That's super interesting because in terms of model quality, for me, there's nothing better than Claude, particularly once the MCP servers came out. And I've verified this with other professional programmers that Claude Sonnet 3.5 blows AI, OpenAI out of the water, blows DeepSeek out of the water. And they are like, I won't switch from it. I am now stuck in a loop where I run out of Claude credits every few hours.
You could pay money to,
No,
right?
no, you can't. This is the crazy thing, is that Claude within the chatbot interface you cannot. But a programmer ran into the same problem that I ran into, and so he created a GitHub, which then creates through WebSockets a way called Kibits, which I've now downloaded. So when I do run out of the Claude credits, then I switch over to that. And the funny thing is that in order to install it, I got Claude MCP to install it for me. So I didn't have to read through everything. I just did Claude MCP, got it installed, but then something went wrong. So I need to actually go back and redo it.
Thanks.
Yeah.
uh, yeah,
Mhm.
ground truth. Ground
Yeah.
truth is a critical thing. Anyway, Core thing that I began to learn, and I refer to this as, and I'm good at pattern recognition. And, by the time I got into the newsletter and started writing it and started getting a reputation, I started to rely on the fact that I did pattern recognition and I had intuition and I could predict what would happen. Not
Interesting.
always, right? Not
Yeah.
timing, but
Yeah.
I could see in my mind's eye how things would go. This goes back to that psychedelics
I
thing.
can.
Right? I could trip a little and try to kind of see what it would
Yeah.
look like, and then to the degree that I had confidence, I could say that, and that's where my reputation came from because I would say things that people thought was dumb,
Yeah.
but then I turn out to be right, and that reinforces reputation. um, so now I can act with confidence in what I believe about how AI is going to develop. And it hasn't totally happened yet, but I'm pretty sure it's going to. And within a couple of years, I will be proven right.
That we're going to see an apocalypse of AI companies.
In those 2 years, by the end of those 2 years, the apocalypse will have happened, right? And what survives the apocalypse is what's going to be
Protocols.
true.
And that's why MCP actually makes a lot of sense because they're building a mushroom colony layer between your computer and the LLMs and every other service. OpenAI tries to do it with Operator, but they might have made a faulty decision on that. But yeah, the protocol thing is really interesting. I think that's going to be really trippy in terms of the protocol layer for AI. Like Markdown is going to win, JSON is going to win. There's all these technologies that will, but then the AI will just take more and more of it, so we won't even see it. It'll just be me talking with the AI via my voice or via text, and then it going out and using all of these protocols to do it basically. Okay, well that is an interesting. Next time we're going to talk about meeting Steve Jobs and meeting Bill Gates. We'll actually probably do it in person down in Buenos Aires. So thank you all for tuning in.